A quiet California suburb. A woman wakes to a flashlight in her face, a man's voice hissing threats through a ski mask. Her hands are tied. In the next room, her husband is forced to lie face down on the floor, plates stacked on his back. "If I hear these rattle, you both die." For decades, stories like this were whispered across communities from Sacramento to Orange County. A faceless predator moved silently through backyards and bedrooms, leaving behind shattered lives and no trace of who he was. Police gave him different names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. The public knew only fear. By the late 1980s, the attacks suddenly stopped. The case went cold. Files gathered dust, and the masked intruder became more legend than suspect. No one knew that the man responsible was living among them, raising a family, shopping for groceries. Until 40 years later, DNA finally gave him a name. This is the story of the Golden State Killer, one of America's most prolific and elusive predators, and how, after 4 decades of dead ends, science and persistence finally cornered him. In this video, we'll trace his crimes from the first strange burglaries to the brutal rapes and murders that terrorized California. We'll see how early investigations missed chances, how different jurisdictions failed to connect the dots, and why this case haunted detectives long after they retired. Most importantly, we'll examine the groundbreaking use of genetic genealogy, how anonymous DNA from crime scenes was compared to public family tree databases and led to a former police officer named Joseph James DeAngelo. If you're fascinated by true crime, forensic breakthroughs, and the ethics of modern policing, stay with me to the end, because the way this case was solved is changing investigations worldwide. And if you enjoy deep dives like this, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. To understand how the Golden State Killer evaded justice for so long, we have to start where investigators did, with what seemed like minor, bizarre crimes. In the early 1970s, the quiet city of Visalia experienced a rash of strange burglaries. A prowler broke into homes, rifled through drawers, sometimes stole small personal items, but ignored cash and valuables. He was dubbed the Visalia Ransacker. Residents felt violated yet confused. This wasn't typical theft. He seemed more interested in the people than the property. On September 11, 1975, things escalated. The ransacker entered the Snelling home, attempting to kidnap teenaged Beth Snelling. Her father, journalism professor Claude Snelling, confronted the intruder and was shot dead. The ransacker vanished into the night. At the time, investigators saw a dangerous burglar and a murderer, but not the opening chapter of a serial predator's career. That connection would only be suspected decades later, when old evidence met new DNA technology. By 1976, terror shifted north to the Sacramento area. A new offender, soon called the East Area Rapist, began stalking middle-class neighborhoods. He chose single-story homes near parks, canals, or open fields, easy escape routes. Victims reported similar patterns: crank phone calls, strange noises outside at night, windows pried open, items mysteriously moved. Then, late-night attacks. The intruder wore a ski mask, carried a gun or knife, and spoke through clenched teeth. He bound victims with ligatures he brought or improvised from shoelaces and blinds. At first, he targeted women alone, but as news spread and couples tried to protect each other, he adapted. He started attacking when husbands or boyfriends were present, forcing the man to lie face down, tying him up, and stacking dishes on his back. While he assaulted the woman in another room, he threatened to kill them both if he heard so much as a clink. Fear in Sacramento exploded. People bought dogs, installed locks, and slept with guns. The East Area Rapist wasn't just brutal, he was methodical. He studied his victims. Many reported months of suspicious phone calls, heavy breathing, hang-ups, or a man asking for someone who didn't live there. Others noticed open gates, missing items, or strange break-ins where nothing significant was taken. Investigators later realized he often entered homes beforehand, unlocking windows, unloading guns, or moving objects so he could navigate in the dark. He sometimes ate food from the kitchen, drank beer, or left odd displays, suggesting a chilling comfort in his victims' spaces. During attacks, he displayed disturbing control. He'd whisper or hiss commands, pretend to be multiple people by changing his voice, and meticulously tie and retie ligatures. Sometimes he'd disappear, only to reappear minutes later, as if toying with his victims' minds. Despite massive community meetings, composite sketches, and task forces, he always slipped away, darting through backyards and creeks, vanishing into the night before police arrived. Between 1976 and 1979, the East Area Rapist committed at least 50 known sexual assaults across Northern California. Entire neighborhoods lived under siege. Hardware stores ran out of deadbolts. Shooting ranges saw spikes in attendance. Men formed informal patrols, yet he always seemed one step ahead. The attacks followed a rough pattern but varied enough to keep police guessing. Sometimes he'd place ligatures within easy reach before breaking in. In other cases, he used shoelaces taken from inside the home. He occasionally took souvenirs, jewelry, ID cards, or personal mementos. The media, under pressure from terrified residents, released limited details. Some victims later expressed frustration. They felt the full horror wasn't shared, possibly to avoid panic. Meanwhile, despite hundreds of tips, no usable suspect emerged. Investigators knew this offender could escalate. Many serial rapists eventually progressed to murder, but they didn't know when or where he'd make that leap. Then, in 1979, the attacks in Sacramento abruptly stopped. As Sacramento breathed a cautious sigh of relief, a new nightmare began hundreds of miles south. In 1979, a series of brutal murders struck Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. The killer attacked couples in their homes, binding them and bludgeoning or shooting them to death. This offender was dubbed the original Night Stalker, to distinguish him from another serial predator later known simply as the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. The crimes were horrendous. In Goleta, Dana and Cherry Dominguez were murdered in their home. In Ventura, Lyman and Charlene Smith were killed. In Orange County, Keith and Patrice Harrington, and later others, met similar fates. The attacks bore eerie similarities to the East Area Rapist: suburban homes near open spaces, ligatures, evidence of pre-attack stalking. But at the time, investigators in Southern California had no idea they were likely dealing with the same man who'd terrorized Sacramento. The link between the rapist and the killer wouldn't be definitively proven until DNA evidence matured years later. By the mid-1980s, the murders stopped as abruptly as the earlier rapes had, but the cases, scattered across multiple counties, remained unsolved. Then, in 1989, forensic science took a leap that would eventually tie everything together: DNA profiling. Investigators had preserved biological evidence from both rape and murder scenes. Initially, lab work was limited, but as technology advanced in the 1990s, forensic teams began uploading DNA profiles into CODIS, the FBI's national database. A critical discovery emerged. The DNA from the East Area Rapist cases in Northern California matched the DNA from the Southern California original Night Stalker murders. The rapist and the killer were the same man. This new combined offender became known in media and investigative circles as the Golden State Killer, a single predator responsible for at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries. Investigators finally had a cohesive picture, but CODIS searches returned no direct hit. Their unknown subject had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. Through the 1990s and 2000s, detectives and cold case units continued to chase leads. They created offender profiles, likely white male born between 1940 and 1960, familiar with police tactics, comfortable moving silently through suburban terrain. Some believed he might have military or law enforcement experience. Cops re-interviewed old witnesses, re-examined phone records, and revisited crime scenes. Several promising suspects emerged, ex-boyfriends, suspicious neighbors, disgruntled co-workers, but one by one, their DNA ruled them out. A massive online community of amateur sleuths also formed, analyzing timelines, maps, and behavioral patterns. Author Michelle McNamara helped bring renewed attention with her meticulous reporting and her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, a title taken from a chilling threat the killer once uttered. Yet despite all this focus, the case remained unsolved. Traditional methods, fingerprints, photo lineups, informants, had failed. What cracked the case would come from a completely different direction: genealogy. Around the early 2010s, a small revolution began quietly reshaping cold case work: genetic genealogy. Companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe popularized consumer DNA tests. People spat into tubes, mailed them off, and received ethnicity breakdowns and lists of potential relatives. Separately, open-source platforms like GEDmatch allowed users to upload raw DNA data and search for genetic matches, often to build family trees or find biological parents. Crucially, many users left their profiles public. A few visionary investigators and genealogists realized something. If you could upload a crime scene DNA profile to a site like GEDmatch, you might find distant relatives of an unknown suspect, second, third, or fourth cousins. From there, you could build reverse family trees, narrowing down possible offenders based on age, location, and gender. This technique was untested, ethically murky, and legally ambiguous. But for cases like the Golden State Killer, where all traditional avenues were exhausted, it represented a risky, game-changing opportunity. In 2018, investigator Paul Holes and a small team of detectives, analysts, and a genetic genealogist took the bold step. They converted the Golden State Killer's crime scene DNA into a format compatible with GEDmatch and uploaded it as an anonymous user. They didn't find a perfect match, but they did find several distant relatives, mostly third and fourth cousins. Using traditional genealogy methods, census records, obituaries, public documents, the team built massive family trees branching back to the 1800s. Then came the hard part: working forward. Who, among the living descendants, was a white male of the right age, with ties to the California areas where the crimes occurred, and a plausible background matching behavioral clues? It was painstaking detective work merged with family history research. Eventually, a name began to stand out: Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer who had lived and worked in several of the affected regions during the 1970s and early 1980s. Joseph James D'Angelo seemed to fit alarmingly well. Born in 1945, he served in the Navy, later becoming a police officer in Exeter and Auburn, both near early crime locations. He was known by some colleagues for a temper. He was even fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting. But genealogy alone wasn't proof. Investigators needed a direct DNA match, so they quietly surveilled D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb. They followed him, waiting for him to discard something containing his DNA, a tissue, a drink cup, anything. When he finally did, they collected it, sent it to the lab, and compared the profile to the Golden State Killer's crime scene DNA. The result? A near-perfect match. After more than 40 years, detectives had their suspect. On April 24, 2018, officers surrounded D'Angelo's home and arrested the 72-year-old grandfather in his driveway. The Phantom had a face, and it was disturbingly ordinary. Following his arrest, the public saw D'Angelo for the first time in court, frail-looking, in an orange jumpsuit, slumped in a wheelchair. But prosecutors alleged a lifetime of monstrous behavior behind that appearance. Because many of the rapes were beyond the statute of limitations, D'Angelo was formally charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 kidnapping-related charges. As part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he admitted to dozens of additional rapes and crimes in a detailed, chilling hearing. Survivors and family members of victims finally confronted him, reading impact statements that spanned decades of grief, fear, and lost normalcy. D'Angelo, mostly expressionless, occasionally muttered a soft apology. In August 2020, he was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The Golden State Killer would die in prison. But the way he'd been caught ignited a fierce debate that extended far beyond one man. How should we use DNA and genealogy in law enforcement? The capture of the Golden State Killer offers several powerful takeaways about crime, technology, and justice. First, persistence matters. This case was solved because detectives refused to give up, preserving evidence and revisiting it as science advanced. Without decades of careful storage and documentation, there would have been no DNA to analyze. Second, genetic genealogy is a revolutionary tool. By using distant relatives' DNA, investigators can identify suspects who've never been arrested. Since D'Angelo's arrest, dozens of other cold cases have been solved using similar methods. Third, it raises serious privacy and ethical questions. Many GED match users didn't realize their publicly shared DNA profiles might be used for criminal investigations involving relatives they never met. Lawmakers, courts, and companies are still grappling with how to balance public safety with genetic privacy. Finally, the case shows how one predator can traumatize entire communities for generations, and how, even decades later, truth and accountability still matter deeply to survivors. If you've watched this far, you now understand how a faceless predator who stalked California in the 1970s and 80s was finally unmasked by a combination of old-fashioned police work and cutting-edge DNA science. Stories like the Golden State Killer case are about more than one man's crimes. They're about the victims and survivors who demanded answers, the investigators who refused to let the trail go cold, and the powerful but complicated tools we're giving to law enforcement. If you'd like more deep, carefully researched breakdowns of major true crime cases and forensic breakthroughs, this is where I post them. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and let me know in the comments which cold case or forensic technique you want covered next. You can also share this video with someone interested in how DNA is reshaping criminal investigations. It helps more than you'd think, and it keeps these important stories and their lessons alive.